Hi everyone, welcome to today's live session introducing ITIL 4. We're just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to dial in and then we'll be starting off in about 3 minutes. Hi everyone, hopefully we've got a good chunk of people dialed in now so we can get started. Welcome to the AXELOS webinar introducing ITIL 4. Good morning or afternoon depending on where you are in the world. My name is Claire and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for ITIL. We also have Gemma here who is the Marketing Lead for ITIL. Before I hand you over to our presenter Akshay, I just want to run through a few housekeeping bits before we start. So firstly, everyone is on mute, so if you want to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A box down at the bottom. We're already getting a few coming in already, which is great. Obviously, if these are technical questions, Gemma and I can try and answer them as soon as possible to try and help you out. We will be collecting sort of more of the ITIL-specific questions for a Q&A for Akshay to answer at the end of the webinar. We will try and get through as many of these as possible. If we don't, we will try and get back to you to make sure you can get an answer. We will be recording the session as well, so you'll be emailed a copy of the recording tomorrow. The webinar is due to run for about 45 minutes with about 15 minutes at the end for questions, give or take a few times. So that does mean we'll get through as many questions as we can. That's it from me. So I can now pass you over to Akshay. Akshay is our product ambassador here at AXELOS for ITIL. He's been working on new guidance and research and has played an integral role in the ITIL 4 project. So Akshay, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Claire, and thanks everyone for making the time to listen to this webinar. Well, it's the morning here in the UK, but whatever time it is, wherever you are in the world. Looking at some of the questions coming in, it looks like I will be addressing most of these questions during the session. So by all means, if at the end of the webinar you don't feel like I've addressed the question adequately, I would request that you retype your question in so it sort of floats to the top of the list or in the Q&A panel, and then Claire and Gemma can help me with answering those questions as well. So we're here to talk about ITIL 4, and on the agenda today we're going to be talking about it's not progressing. There we go. We're going to be talking about a little bit of background context. Why does ITIL need an update? How did we go about the update itself? Once I get that preamble out of the way, I will be spending some time talking about the key concepts that you can expect to see when you read the book and when you take an ITIL Foundation class, for example. And those are certain key macro concepts, but I'll also be talking about what ITIL 4 calls practices. For now, let me just say that practices are essentially processes, ITIL v3 processes on steroids, but there are some other differences. And I'll be talking about that in a great deal of detail. And last but not least, we'll talk about the ITIL 4 certification scheme and the journey to transition from the ITIL v3 scheme to the ITIL 4 scheme. So, for those of you who don't know me, I see some familiar faces already typing in questions on the Q&A, but for those of you who don't know me, that's what I look like. That is literally the only blazer I own, so you'll see me wearing that at a lot of events. But as Claire mentioned, I am the product ambassador for the ITSM products, ITIL and any others that AXELOS might decide to invest in. Outside of my passion and love for ITSM and ITIL, I also happen to love comic books and heavy metal, hard rock. So if anyone wants to ask a question about that, I'm more than happy to take the question. My Twitter handle is @blowboy. I'm perhaps not as prolific as some of the other ITSM professionals who are on Twitter, but I'm trying to get more active as days go by. So, why did ITIL need an update? We at AXELOS ran a research program from the beginning of 2017 or late 2016 till about the summer of 2017 to understand what ITIL needed to be for the modern IT organization, how ITIL perhaps was not fit for purpose, if you will, and what needed to be addressed. So we first started by asking ourselves, what were the challenges faced by ITSM professionals today, or by organizations investing in IT service management? And the first was the emergence of other frameworks and methods. There's been a lot of digital ink that's been spilled on talking about DevOps and Agile and BRMI. Lately, COVID has announced an update. ISO has also updated ISO 20K. There's a lot of frameworks out there, and this has also given rise to, should we say, a lot of dogmatists, people who believe that only one framework is needed, and their pet framework or their favorite framework is the single framework that can address all issues. And so this emergence of frameworks and methods has led to a lot of fragmentation of thought leadership. It's created a lot of confusion for service providers and service management organizations. The second is unimodal, bimodal, trimodal thinking. Gartner came up with this phrase of bimodal IT some years ago, where they're trying to describe that some parts of the organization need to move fast, so sort of agile, software development, DevOps, etc. And some parts of the organizations didn't need to move quite as fast. And what that created is a sort of tribe of cool kids versus tribe of dinosaurs within organizations. Some people like Simon Wardley, for example, with their pioneer settlers townspeople model, have to try to describe three modes of operation. And as I mentioned in the previous point, there are some people who believe that the entire organization has to work in one way. I personally like to say that organizations have many modes. It's multimodal. Different parts of the organization move at different speeds, but it's like a clock. If you remember the old clocks before digital clocks came around, the old clocks had many gears of many different sizes which moved at many different speeds, but ultimately it was one clock that showed the time on the face of the clock. And that's what IT organizations really are like. Different parts of the organization move at different speeds. We can't force them into an arbitrary construct of saying that there can only be 2 speeds or 3 speeds or just 1 speed. It's many speeds, and we have to acknowledge that and figure out a way to integrate that into ways of working. And the last one to highlight here is product-centric approaches. Again, I mentioned the rise of these frameworks like DevOps and Agile, which are very much focused on software development, although Agile certainly has been applied in many other areas outside of software development. But this has given rise to people and organizations thinking in terms of the product, as in, I will create this software product and I have therefore created value for my customer. And the research and the science of service management tells us otherwise. So, my animations are out of sync here. So this has given rise to what we like to call anti-patterns in service management. So the first is the maturity improvement program. A lot of times, maturity improvement programs add a lot of value into organizations. Certainly when things are being done ad hoc and you're trying to create a little bit of formalization, a little bit of structure and scaffolding, you reap a lot of benefits by doing that. But as you start to increase in maturity, these programs start to have diminishing returns. And at some point, and that point varies depending on which organization is undertaking these improvement initiatives, these programs tend to become vanity projects. Somebody can say, oh, we went from a maturity level of X to a maturity level of Y. That's not necessarily what the business or the organization needs. Sometimes what an organization needs is for IT to just be able to do its job more effectively or quicker. And certainly there might be some localized maturity initiatives that can help. But by and large, these organization-wide maturity improvement programs tend to be vanity projects rather than some things that add a lot of value into organizations. We have watermelon SLAs. Now, when I present this in front of a live audience, I usually ask people in a show of hands to tell me if they know what a watermelon SLA is. Obviously, I can't see any of our audience here. So I'll just describe it for you. A watermelon SLA is one that's green on the outside but red on the inside. In other words, the service provider thinks that they're doing well, they're reporting greens, but their customers and their users are unhappy, they're in the red. And this typically happens because the service provider is either being forced to, or because they don't know any better, are delivering to a preset list of outputs. That might be formalized in the form of a contract with the penalties attached to it. And so the service provider is not trying to lose money. They're trying to still deliver what the customer is asking for, something that's been defined in a document. But oftentimes what the users need are the outcomes. They need to be able to continue to contact external customers via email, for example. They need to still be able to process the payment through the system. They don't necessarily need a closed incident ticket that says, user error, for example. And so there's a variety of reasons that led to these watermelon SLAs. But this is something that we see time and again in many organizations around the world. The next one is this join the dots ITIL implementation, or ITIL in a box paradigm. Now, I realize there are probably many tool vendors, many consultants on the webinar here, but there's been a lot of ITIL in a box, quote unquote, solutions or products that have come out of consulting and tool vendors domains. Now, look, I used to be a consultant before I joined AXELOS. I'm guilty of this as well. And these ITIL in a box products tend to be start with incident and move on to problem, then go on to change, do a little bit of CMDB, and it's convenient when an organization doesn't have anything and they're trying to figure out where to start. But one of the concepts or mantras of ITIL v3 has always been adapt and adopt and continually improve. So it might actually be that the organization's journey does not need to start with incident management. It might need to start with service desk. It might need to start with service portfolio. It might need to start with capacity management. It could be anywhere. But we've gotten into this habit of thinking that I need to start with incident, and then I need to go to problem, and then I need to go to change. And the last one, I talked about it a couple of times on the previous slide. We see the single silver bullet mentality, the single framework to rule them all, the single framework that will solve all IT issues. This is becoming more and more prevalent. I see it in a lot of conferences that I attend, that people continuously use this language of unless you adopt this methodology, unless you adopt this paradigm, you will die. And people are reacting to that out of fear, instead of out of a genuine need to help their organizations do better. We also talked about the value of ITIL, and we were glad to see during the research program that ITIL is still quite widely adopted, and it is moving out of infrastructure. We see ITIL now commonly being embedded at even in the business unit side in order to help them articulate the service outcomes that they need from IT, and that cascades all the way into IT. We see software development teams starting to take up some of the guidance in helping with incident or problem management. There's a great case study on the AXELOS website, and I encourage everyone to go through it, which talks about Spotify's journey with ITIL. Spotify being one of these sort of unicorns that everybody looks up to in the software development world. A lot of people might not think that they use ITIL, but we have a very good case study that talks about how they've used ITIL outside of infrastructure management or service desk type domains where you typically see ITIL embedded in an organization. The certifications are still definitely valued by companies and professionals. The certifications and the training provide organizations and professionals with a common language, a common dictionary of concepts, and this is something that we were encouraged to continue with the development of ITIL. And the last, and this is certainly the thing that pleased me the most, is we saw an overwhelming response from the community at large who wanted to contribute back into ITIL4, which would in turn help them do their jobs better. But it wasn't all roses. There were some challenges that ITIL also faces that we need to address. The first is that the guidance is too vast. The learning journey is too complicated. For those of you like me who've purchased all 6 books of ITIL v3, it's approximately 2,200, 2,300 odd pages, maybe about 10 kilos by weight. We realized we really needed to slim that down. We needed to make the guidance much more accessible and easy to adapt, but we also needed to simplify the learning journey. We currently have 10 intermediate qualifications after foundation, 5 lifecycle, 4 capability, and ITIL practitioner. You can take any mix of them as needed, and a lot of people said that was very confusing, having to keep track of points and having to keep track of which certifications they could take and not take. Outside of classrooms, outside of some of the thought leaders and evangelists, the learnings of adapt and adopt and continually improve are forgotten. Now, there are some organizations that do these very well, but by and large, a significant majority have forgotten these lessons, and we need to be able to reinforce them with ITIL4. And I already talked about how the guidance needs to be accessible by slimming it down, by making it more readable, or as my colleague Roman says, making it more human readable. We could make sure that the guidance could be practical, it could be lean, it could be slimmed down, and much more useful. So after the research program, we kicked off the ITIL update program, and we started by defining the core team within AXELOS. People from product management, people like Roman from development, myself contributing as an SME. We identified people in exams, translations, and so on. And once we set up the AXELOS team, we went out and identified a core lead architect team. And I don't have a slide in this deck about who's in the lead architect team. We have a mix of old and new people. Well, I don't mean old in terms of age. I mean old in terms of involvement with ITIL. So we have some of the familiar faces like Stuart Rance, or Lou Honeybeck, who were involved with part of ITIL v3 development, service transition, for example. someone like Barclay Ray, who was involved in ITIL practitioner. But we also have a lot of new people. For example, Erin Castile from Sydney, who is part of the ISO 20K committee, but she works a lot in Southeast Asia, and she was able to bring the perspectives of that part of the world to bear. Takashi Yagi, who's from Hitachi, based in Tokyo, he's also involved with ISO, and he's able to bring that Far East perspective, having worked across Japan and a lot of countries in that part of the world. Mauricio Corona, Director of SDI International, based in Mexico City. He's done a lot of work in South America, and he was able to bring a lot of those experiences to bear. So we certainly try to build the architect team for diversity of experience, diversity of culture and geography as well. And once we'd formed the architect team, we then issued a call for contributors, whether they were writers, advisors, exam developers, testers, and so on. And we had a really great response from end users, consultants, trainers, analysts, tool vendors, and so on. And from that, we were able to put a smaller number under NDA. We faced some restrictions with certain companies trying to agree to sign an NDA, but we put as many as we could under NDA so that they could take part in testing sessions, take part in workshops, or do some of the writing or reviewing for us. As things stand now, and these numbers are as of a month ago, or less than a month ago, we have about 3,000 people signed up in our community platform, taking part in surveys, answering questions posed by various people from AXELOS in terms of what they're looking for from ITIL products, testing potential names of certifications even. And then we also have about 162 or 163 people, I think, who are under NDA, who are actively authoring and reviewing the content right now. So during our first workshop, we came up with 6 design principles for the update, what would be ITIL 4. The first is that the content needs to be modular. This would allow us to update different parts of the documentation, at different parts of the guidance at different times. So we could update service desk or incident management a lot more frequently than we would update strategy management, for example. The guidance needs to be lean. It needed to be slimmed down as much as possible so that guidance was easy to find. We would have lesser chances of inconsistency from one section to the next. It needed to be practical so that people could immediately apply this without too much effort or investment. It needed to be evolutionary, which is to say it needed to be backward compatible. This would allow organizations that have invested in ITIL thus far, or individuals that have invested in ITIL thus far, to continue to derive value from their investments, but at the same time, the guidance would show them the way forward. It needed to be collaborative. I've just talked about the number of people who've been involved. The more people we have involved, the more regions of the world we connect with, the better the guidance will be, the less biased the guidance will be. And last but certainly not least, it needed to be flexible, which is to say that it needed to be able to show how to integrate with other frameworks, whether they were best practice frameworks or evolving frameworks. So from ISO and COVID to KCS or DevOps and Agile communities and so on. So let's get into some of the key concepts. One of the questions we're often asked is, how would we position ITIL in today's modern IT organization? And I like to give the analogy of a garden. Now, I really wish my garden looked like the picture you're seeing in front of you. It unfortunately is a bit less than that, quite a bit less than that. But for me, in my garden, I have a trellis. In some part of the world, trellis is known as a pergola, or pergola. I'm not quite sure how that's pronounced. It's essentially a wooden or metallic structure that creates a pleasing shape once plants are grown on it. And on that trellis, I'm able to attach the pins and wiring and twine, essentially scaffolding and support for my plants, my creepers, to be able to grow up up the trellis so that they create that pleasing shape and they bring value to my garden. And so for me, ITIL is very much that trellis or that pergola. It creates the shape and connects different parts of the service organization. It's a connective tissue of the service provider. And on this trellis, on this underlying framework, we're able to create or apply these scaffolding frameworks, risk management, project management, software development techniques, and so on, to help us develop, run, and maintain our products and services. The products and services themselves are kind of like the plants, the creepers that I grow in my garden. Because once they're grown, once they achieve that pleasing shape, they create value for me as well as for the garden. And that's how I like to talk about ITIL in today's IT organization. So one of the changes that we needed to introduce with ITIL 4 is changing the language of service management and moving away from this concept of delivering value. Now, as I said, I used to be a consultant before I joined AXELOS. I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. I always talked about delivering value. The service provider does something and they have delivered value to customers. But what the service provider has actually done is that they've taken on costs and risks. They've not actually they've delivered products and services. What they've not delivered is value. Value comes from recognizing that there are multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem: consumers, suppliers, regulatory authorities, tax authorities, perhaps even society at large. And the service provider enters a service relationship with these stakeholders, and through the service relationship, the service provider co-creates value. So, for example, when my bank creates a mobile banking app for my smartphone, they've taken on all the costs and risks to develop and to release that app. But all their efforts to that point have not actually created value. It's only when I'm able to use the app to pay my bills, it's only when I am in that transactional relationship with the bank that value is being created. And value is being created for me. It's being created for the beneficiary who's receiving my money. It's created for the bank who's getting the data and perhaps some fees from the transaction. So we need to change the language of service management and get people to start talking about co-creation of value. In order for service providers to recognize how to co-create value, we needed to think about what are the things that organizations need to do in order to create the products and services that co-create value. And so one of the first models we came up with was this, the 4 dimensions. Now, you could look at this as an evolution from the 4 Ps of service design, but the 4 dimensions are organizations and people, information and technology, partners and suppliers, value streams and processes. The numbers there are not meant to indicate any sort of order of priority. It was just when we didn't have the numbers there, people didn't understand what the 4 dimensions were, so we had to stick the numbers in the diagram. Having said that, I think it's wonderful that organizations and people are number 1. Happy coincidence there. But these are 4 design considerations or 4 resource types that a service provider has at its disposal in order to create products and services. It's also the 4 design considerations or 4 resource types that the service management organization has at its disposal. So when I'm trying to create, for example, an incident management practice, and we'll come to practices later, I need to take into account the skills, the culture, the decision-making authorities in my organization. I need to take into account the information I need, the tools I need, how to interface with partners and suppliers, what sort of value streams or processes I might need in my incident management practice. Outside these 4 dimensions, we have external constraints or influences which affect the way in which a service provider can configure these 4 resource types to create products and services or to create service management capabilities. And we use the PESTLE model from business analysis to describe these constraints. And PESTLE stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. They don't necessarily apply individually. They can combine or themselves in weird and wonderful ways. So, for example, data privacy started off as a social concern. A lot of people were starting to ask for companies to adopt data privacy or data encryption. This then became a political topic. Members of the European Parliament, for example, started to debate it. Members of Parliament here in the UK certainly started to debate it. And then the EU finally passed GDPR, which, due to the interconnectedness of systems, essentially most of the world has had to adopt. And so now data privacy is a legal factor, which impacts the way in which we provide access to information assets. It influences the types of tools we use. It influences the types of suppliers we work with, and so on. The next macro model we developed was a service value system, which describes the various components of a service provider that are needed in order to convert opportunities or demand for work into value for one or more stakeholders. I'll be going through each of these components in a little bit more detail, but very quickly, 5 components: guiding principles, which are ways of working; governance, which is how an organization evaluates, directs, and monitors its performance; service value chain, which you could say is a core model somewhat analogous to what the service lifecycle used to be in ITIL v3, but it's a set of loosely connected activities that a service provider would have to undertake. We have practices, which, as I mentioned before, kind of like processes on steroids. The practices used to be called capabilities. So these were organizational capabilities to manage incidents, to manage relationships, to manage capacity or availability or information security or what have you. And the word practices proved to be very difficult to translate into a number of languages that ITIL and AXELOS support. And so practices was actually a word in the ITIL v3 glossary, which basically meant the same thing. And so we adopted the word practices instead of capabilities with ITIL 4. And last but certainly not least is continual improvement. So the whole system, from guiding principles, governance, service value chain to practices, the whole system is subject to continual improvement. Indeed, continual improvement is subject to continual improvement as well. So very quickly, guiding principles, as I said, they're ways of working. They're not methods of working. They are more like philosophies or approaches to figure out how to work. And this is where I believe we've connected the strongest link with lean and agile teams and DevOps teams. So for example, the guiding principle of progress iteratively with feedback, that's an agile methodology. And what we're saying is service management can also follow the same techniques that are used in agile methods. So continual improvement, for example, can take the same cadence as your time-boxed iteration of development. Speaking of software development teams, if you apply keep it simple and practical and focus on value, you can engage in a discussion with your development teams about the need for change management or change control, as it's called in ITIL 4, and why change control adds value not just for development teams, but for customers, for governance, risk and compliance, for auditors, and so on. And then you look at making the change control processes as simple and as practical as possible. Focus on value, as I said, was first talked about in ITIL practitioner. It's a concept that lean and agile teams certainly talk about, but they usually frame their discussions from the point of view of value for customers. And as we've talked about before, ITIL talks about value for multiple stakeholders. And I believe that by introducing this concept of multiple stakeholders into ITIL 4, as service management professionals, we can go back to these DevOps teams, to these agile teams, and talk about all the other stakeholders whose needs need to be met. And these can then take the form of more user stories, more functional and non-functional requirements, and so on. The next one, the service value chain, as I said, was is roughly analogous to in positioning as the service lifecycle was in ITIL version 3. It's essentially a set of 6 loosely connected activities that any service provider, whether it's an individual developer managing a microservice or the entire enterprise managing services being delivered to customers, these activities will be undertaken at some point. So the service provider organization, as I said, whether it's one person or the entire enterprise, will be engaging with external stakeholders at some point. The organization will be planning its work at some point. It will be delivering and supporting live services at some point. It will be looking for ways to improve at some point. It will be looking at obtaining, acquiring, or building service components at some point. It will be looking at defining or designing its service components and transitioning those components into a live state at some point. So as I said, 6 loosely connected activities. There's not meant to be a single pathway through these activities. We certainly didn't want to create an illusion of a stage-gated, waterfall-y way of you have to first go to plan and then go to design and then go to obtain, etc. That's certainly one path, but there are many other paths. These paths through the service value chain are what we refer to as value streams. And service provider organizations can have multiple value streams. In ITIL 4, a value stream always starts with demand. It always ends with value. So for example, a value stream of customer support might take a path like this, where we engage with the demand, with the customer calling in saying, hey, I need some help. We do some initial triaging and analysis. We decide that we need a new service component. That could be a new laptop. It could be a new piece of code or a patch or a hotfix downloaded from a vendor's website, a replacement to a server or a wireless router, whatever it might be. We obtain, we build that component. We then transition it into a live state. We check that the incident's been resolved, and once it has, we've restored value to the customer. But the value stream might not even stop there. It might actually go all the way back into engage, where we go back to the person calling in to say, hey, how did we do? How can we do better? And that might lead to some improvement activities, which then benefit or change how deliver and support might work. And that, again, creates value both for the customer as well as ourselves. So as you can see from this very simple example, the value stream is not meant to be a linear unidirectional flow. It can go back and forth through any of these activities. I recognize that plan is not actually one of the activities that this flow goes through. There are other example flows that I have that show a journey through plan, but in a sense, the value stream can go back and forth as many times as needed. And once you've mapped out a value stream, you can then figure out how to apply techniques like value stream optimization to reduce the number of steps it takes to move from demand to value. So let's talk briefly about practices. You recognize this diagram from earlier. Practices, as I said, was a term in the V3 glossary, which basically said it was a way of working or a way in which work must be done. A practice describes management structures, culture, skills, processes, information, tools, the role of partners and suppliers. Essentially, it's the 4 dimensions applied to what used to be called processes in ITIL V3. So we can talk about, for example, the incident management practice and apply the 4 dimensions thinking to describing all the various components of the incident management practice. So we're moving the focus away from just the process, the steps of incident management. And these practices support the activities of the service value chain. So the incident management practice does not belong to deliver and support in the same way that incident management belonged to service operations. Now, the irony is that the incident management guidance in ITIL V3 talked about incident management's contribution to service design and service transition and so on. But because it was published in a book called Service Operations, people saw it as an operational process only. And we were keen to avoid that with ITIL 4. And because of that, we've decoupled the activities that are needed to do something from the capabilities that the organization has to accomplish those activities. They are 2 separate concepts now. So the engage activity, where I'm interfacing with an XL stakeholder to empathize with their demand, to recognize, to acknowledge the demand, and so on, might actually be supported by organizational capabilities around relationship management or supplier management, business analysis, service desk, incident management, and so on. There can be multiple organizational capabilities that are brought to bear. So practices at a glance. There are three types of practices. We've got general management practices, which originated in business domains and were adopted by service management organizations. And a way of thinking about them is that they're focused on overarching capabilities across multiple value chains. There are 14 of them there. I've got a slide which lists them all. We've got service management practices, which originated in the service management domain. It has a common goal. They have common goals across various value chains, but they might have different approaches. So one value chain that's used by a development organization might have different approaches, different techniques than and another value stream that's used by, let's say, the service desk. So there are 17 practices in service management. This is our bread and butter as service management professionals. This is where you'd find incident, problem, change, and so on. And last but certainly not least, we've got technology management practices, which originated in technology domains, but have an impact or have been adopted by service management. And it's focused on the use of technology, but as a service component, or technology as a service, if you will. And there are three practices there. Here's a list of general management practices. The white ones are ones that were largely unchanged from ITIL v3. The orange ones are ones that were significantly modified. And well, when I say significant, I don't mean wholesale changes. It could be a subtle change, but that has significant implications. And we have some ones in red, which are things that are new to ITIL 4. So ITIL v3 didn't talk in too much detail about things like project management or risk management or workforce and talent management. And with ITIL 4, we have an opportunity to say these are some of the capabilities that a service provider needs in order to be able to create the products and services that co-create value with customers. Some of the ones in orange you would have recognized as service management capabilities defined in ITIL version 3, but we've now said these are actually business capabilities that need to be adopted by service management. So the business, the enterprise, needs to have a general business approach to information security or knowledge management or supply management or relationship management, because they also do the same things. So it's better for service management to adopt the way the business wants to work rather than trying to create something just for the service management organization. With service management capabilities, we do see a significant amount of change in some of our core practices like incident and problem. We've decoupled release from deployment. Deployment is now a technical practice and release is a service management practice. We've introduced some new ones. So IT asset management is split out of service asset and configuration management. Service design is a new one, and this is about designing a good experience for customers and the users of the service management systems. Change management, as I said, has been refocused to change control, and it's about making sure that changes at the point of deployment or at the point of change are put through in a controlled manner. This is not meant to be a bureaucratic, top-down heavy, cab every week practice. This is about saying that you can adopt as loose governance or as rigid a governance as you want. This is not about a singular process. You can use different techniques like peer reviews, end of sprint demos, your project steering committee, whatever it might be, to be the approval authority should you need one. But it's about making sure that the changes are made in a controlled manner rather than in a very ad hoc or ungoverned manner. And lastly, but not least, technology management practices. As I said, release was decoupled from deployment. So deployment talks about actually pushing out service components into a live environment, versus release is making that functionality available to users. Two functions of the prior version have now been made practices. So application management is now software development and management, and technical management or technology management is now infrastructure and platform management. So we're taking the functions and we're saying that these are actually organizational capabilities. And as I said, these practices support the value chain activities. So for example, if you look at the incident management practice, and this is words taken from the book, we can see that the incident management practice has the heaviest contribution, or the highest degree of contribution, to engage and deliver and support activities. It has a lesser contribution with design, transition, obtain, build, and improve. But it's also important to recognize that the tools, techniques, decision-making skills, contracts with partners and suppliers, etc., do not help the service organization plan its work, ensure that everyone's aligned with the same vision, and so on. So for each of the 34 practices in the ITIL 4 Foundation book, you will find a heat map where, through a sort of color coding, we indicate the degree of contribution to each one of these value chain activities. The darker the color, the heavier the contribution, sort of thing. But once we understand how practices contribute to various activities, we're then able to apply this to the values, to combine this with the thinking around value streams. So we can define multiple value streams, and we can say, right, my incident management practice needs to support the yellow value stream at the point of engage and at the point of deliver and support. It needs to support the blue value stream only at the point of deliver and support. It needs to support that green value stream twice in engage, once in deliver and support, once in design and transition. And I only have these 3 value streams, and I've mapped out where incident management needs to play a part. Flipping that the other way, I can say my incident management practice only needs to have these 7 capabilities. I don't need to invest in any additional tooling, any additional process design, any additional RACI development or decision-making development or training or anything like that. I just need to be able to support these 7 capabilities. Or in other words, for me, this is my minimum viable incident management. And so we're able to bring a lot of that lean thinking to ITIL and ITIL practices. As we're not over-investing, we're not investing in maturity improvement initiatives that add very little value. Because unless we're investing in something that appears on a value stream, it's not going to add any value to our organization. So I think this is a very powerful concept, and as it gets taken up by the industry, it's going to lead to a lot of benefits for the community at large. So I'm in the home stretch now. I still have a few slides to go through. I apologize for having to go through them fast, but I do want to keep time for questions and answers. This is the content and qualification structure. So each of the boxes that you see here, with the exception of the 2 light blue ones, is going to be its own book and its own certification and exam. We've just released ITIL Foundation. We're currently working on the 5 modules that you see above it. So the ITIL Specialist, ITIL Strategist, and ITIL Leader modules. The 5 modules are split into 2 work streams. 4 of them are in the ITIL Managing Professional stream. Now what this means is that if you successfully complete the exams and certifications of these 4 modules, you will automatically get the designation of Managing Professional, which is different from what the V3 scheme says, where you need to achieve 17 points and then take an additional capstone exam in order to get that capstone designation of ITIL Expert. In ITIL 4, if you finish the successfully pass, I should say, the 4 certifications in Managing Professional, you get the Managing Professional designation automatically. Similarly, if you finish the 2 certifications successfully in the ITIL Strategic Leader workstream, you will get the Strategic Leader designation automatically. There's no additional exam to take. Now, the sharp-eyed amongst you would notice that there's one module which is common to both workstreams. That's Direct, Plan, and Improve. And because it's common to both workstreams, this module needs to be taken just once. Passing the exam will allow it to count towards both work streams. So really, although there are 6 boxes after Foundation, there are only 5 exams or 5 certifications. Once you get both Managing Professional and Strategic Leader designations, you will be eligible to apply to be an ITIL Master. Now, for those of you who have 17 points in today's V3 scheme or who are already ITIL experts, For you, we're developing a transition module. It's not a bridge. It's a transition module. It's not going to be its own book, but it will be its own course and an exam. And once you complete that exam, you will be your designation will automatically be moved to ITIL for Managing Professional. You don't have to do the 4 underlying modules at that point. This transition module, as I said, is only available for people with 17 points, i.e. people who are about to take MALC, or people who have already completed MALC and who are already holding the ITIL expert designation. There is no transition, there is no bridge at a foundation or post-foundation level until you get to the transition module. So, outside of the certifications, I want to talk about practices a little bit, but I also want to talk a little bit about each of those certifications or modules. The way we're structuring our books, the way we're going about developing our books is by first defining what we want people to be able to learn from these books, learn from the training. And these learning objectives leads us to define the syllabus for the course. It also allows us to understand what non-examinable pieces we need to be able to write about. So content that will appear in the book but won't be taught. This is the approach we took with ITIL 4 Foundation, by the way, which is why you'll find that the book is not 100% examinable. There's a lot of stuff in the book that we don't examine, but we need service management professionals to be able to read and learn about in their own time. Having the syllabus and the understanding what else we need to write about outside of the training objectives allows us to develop a table of contents for the book. We work off of the table of contents and that allows us to create the publication manuscript. In writing the manuscript, we're able to build in the pointers we need to practices and the list of 34 that you saw earlier. Those references are then reflected in the practices documentation. We're going to publish each of the practices separately outside of the core books. But between the practice documentation and the publication manuscript and the syllabus, we then derive the exam questions and the sample papers. I wish I had the time to repeat this, but you can listen to the recording in your own time. But there are 2 very important implications out of this methodology. The first is that the core book is more than just the exam guide. There's going to be more in the book than what you need to pass the exam. This is because in order to provide practical, comprehensive guidance into the hands of the reader, we need to not only focus on what's going to be examined, but we need to paint the complete picture for the service management professional, which means we need to be able to write about more stuff than just what's needed for the exam. For people who are going to be taking the exam, it also means that the training and the exam will cover more than what's in the book. So I mentioned the practices publication. Details on where those publications will be released will be made shortly. But what's going to be in the book is not everything that's going to be covered in the exam. There will be material that gets drawn upon from the practice publications as well. And we're working with our wonderful training provider community to help them pull together material from not just the book, but also from the practices documentation. So what this means in a visual sense is that we develop practices guidance based on proven practical experience. And we're working with some really wonderful people around the world to develop some of this practice guidance. From that, we map what is needed in each of the publications. And equally, if we find that the publication is talking about something that's not part of the practices documentation, we go back and ask ourselves whether we need to move it or reflect it in the practices documentation as well. And we repeat this for each of the 34 practices that we have. So the 34 practices will support all of the modules that you see in the certification scheme. Now, each module in the certification scheme might not draw upon all 34 practices. It will draw upon the most relevant of those 34 practices, but the 2 will be in sync. They will be aligned. So I keep getting asked this question, and I think this was one of the first questions that was asked in the Q&A. What should I do if? Or I have so many points, what should I do? So I thought I'd create a series of slides which talk about this in a very practical sense. So what should I do if I have ITIL V3 Foundation only? Well, you can either get to 17 points and take the transition module, or you can take the ITIL 4 Foundation exam and then continue your learning journey with the ITIL 4 subsequent ITIL 4 modules. What should I do if I have ITIL V3 Foundation and some of the intermediates, but less than 17 points? Well, get to 17 points, so you can take the transition module. Or, if you can't get to 17 points, take the ITIL 4 Foundation now and take one of the subsequent modules that best fits your job role or best fits your skills needs when those modules are released. What should I do if I have ITIL Foundation and enough intermediates to get me to 17 points? Then you can take the transition module, or if you have a need to take MALC now, do so. Look, I was an ex-consultant, and I can tell you that from a business perspective, my billability was far higher if I had the ITIL expert designation. And so if I were in that same position today, my management would be telling me to take MALC, get the ITIL expert designation, and then transition across at some point at the end of this year or next year. So if there's a need, take MALC. If not, wait for the transition module. But I would also add to that, pick up a copy of the ITIL 4 Foundation book and read through it to prepare yourself for transition, but also to start to build in some of that thinking into your work today. Last one, what should I do if I'm already an ITIL expert? Well, read the Foundation book to understand what's changed, and then wait for that transition module. And we're looking to release the Managing Professional, Strategic Leader, and that transition module in the second half of this year. So not too long to wait, all things considered. So let's quickly wrap up. I realize I'm running out of time. ITIL 4 brings in a lot of new concepts and new models, which have been quite well tested. That has led to a new certification structure aligned with some of these concepts. There were some common organizational concerns that we identified during the research initiative, whether ITIL will help my organization support my lean and agile teams, or be more lean and agile, or be more DevOps, whatever that meant, allow my organization to be more cost effective, more compliant with external regulations. Will my prior investment still be relevant? Is ITIL itself still relevant? And we believe the answers to all these questions is still a resounding yes. ITIL is still relevant. What you've got today will still continue to give you value, but ITIL 4 will show you the way forward. And through the new models and concepts that you've seen, we do believe that ITIL will help you achieve your organizational goals as well. From an individual concern, by far the highest percentage of questions have been, will my current certifications be invalidated? And let me be very clear right now, your current certifications, your current designation will not be invalidated. You will still be able to call yourself an ITIL V3 expert or OSA or service strategy certified person. Indeed, people are still calling themselves ITIL V2 managers. We're not taking any of that away from you. So we're not taking away your certifications. They will still be valid. Through the core guidance, as well as all the supplementary content and practices content that we're developing, ITIL will help you do your job better, and it will help you grow your career. A few links here to wrap things up. If you want to find out more about ITIL, you can visit axelos.com/ITIL-update or axelos.com/welcome to ITIL 4. The first link will allow you to sign up to be part of that community of professionals who are helping us with some of our research. And I'd encourage people to sign up to be part of that effort. And if you're interested in being part of the core team to review some of these materials or help with exam testing or exam development, please get in touch. That's my LinkedIn profile URL. You can reach out to me on Twitter as well. Just a request, if you're reaching out to me on LinkedIn, please do send me a note to say that you listened to me on the webinar. at this point, I get about 10 to 15 connection requests a day with absolutely no context or explanation. So I have no idea who these people are, and it's very difficult for me to say yes to that sort of a connection request. So I'm happy to connect with you. Just let me know who you are. So as I said, coming soon, we've got a lot of supplementary content, and later on this year, we've got the rest of the modules that are going to be released. In April, we've got a white paper on ITIL 4 and Agile. We've got a paper talking about VOCR, values, outcomes, costs, and risks, and how that relates to ITIL 4. We've got a paper on the cultural aspects of DevOps and how that ties in with ITIL 4. We've also got a very basic infographic or a primer on the science of service management and concepts around service dominant logic and how those got built into ITIL 4. We're also creating what we're calling the big picture, a single infographic, if you will, that ties all these key concepts together, which came out of a little bit of ad hoc workshopping that we did at the end of last year. And then in May 2019, we'll be looking to publish the benchmark report that many of you have already taken part in over the last couple of weeks. Outside of the papers that we are publishing, I'd also like to let you know that I've co-written a paper on ITIL 4 and Agile Service Management with Atlassian, with the makers of Jira and Confluence. That paper is going to be released at Atlassian Summit, their annual conference, which is coming up in a couple of weeks in Las Vegas. I'm sure it'll be available to download through the Atlassian website as well as the AXELOS website. So please do keep a lookout for that, either on AXELOS' social media platforms or on my LinkedIn page, Twitter page, and so on. And with that said, I realize I've probably gone slightly over time. Claire, I'm sure, is going to slap my wrist at some point. But I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to me. And we can now take any questions.
Yes, thanks, Akshay. Yes, you have gone over time, but I will let you off as we've had some good feedback, so it's okay. But we have got a lot of questions to go through, so obviously I think we'll probably be able to answer a couple of them now, and then what we might have to do is try and collate as much as we can and perhaps send round some written answers for the main questions that we're getting. But we'll do the best we can in the time we've got. We've got a long old list. So I guess one to go for a person working in cloud service management, why is ITIL 4 better than ITIL v3?
In cloud service management, okay, so it's not just cloud service management. There's a lot of different domains. So I'd like to generalize my answer first. ITIL 4 definitely provides a much more dynamic and flexible way of approaching service management, not just from an operational perspective, but even in what used to be ITIL v3 processes around capacity, availability, continuity, etc. Now, some of these processes change with the use of cloud computing. And I believe Mark O'Loughlin, who's the president of the Cloud Credentials Council, has written a paper highlighting some of the important changes that ITIL 4 introduces and how that will help organizations using various cloud computing platforms. So he touches upon things like financial management, change control, and so on. So a lot of the guidance has been re-architected to say newer technologies require newer ways of working. This requires a rethink about how we do service management as well. And ITIL 4 provides some of the tools to help with that rethink.
Okay. Thanks, Akshay. Just going through, trying to find some questions that kind of cover up. We've had a lot of questions around the timings of release for the higher modules, and as you mentioned, we'll be releasing more information about when the specific dates will be in the second half of 2019. So hopefully that's answered quite a few of your questions there. Okay, so next question. Yes, we've had a couple of questions about translations as well. Actually, I'm happy to answer that if you like.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically we've had a question about German and Spanish, so we will be releasing the translations for ITIL 4 Foundation again in the second half of 2019. So the translations we'll be releasing is German, French, Spanish and Japanese. Next question. Well, I guess you can have two more, so I'll just ask, oh yes, could you please shed some light on ISO 20000 with relation to ITIL 4? So basically, can you sort of summarize how ITIL 4 is and ISO work together? I think that summarizes a lot of questions in question.
Yeah, and this relates to multiple other frameworks. This applies equally to ISACA and COBIT as well, or Open Group and IT for IT. We've had a number of practitioners, some of them core members of the other bodies of knowledge. So Erin Castile and Takashi Yagi, two of the architects on ITIL, as I said, were are editors on ISO 20K and are involved with other ISO committees as well. We've had people with deep knowledge of IT for IT, COBIT, BRM, etc., all being involved, people with deep knowledge in DevOps, Agile, etc. We've had a lot of support from these multiple communities, and we've done our best to align the core guidance that's been published in ITIL 4 with the concepts and the language that are used in some of these other bodies of knowledge as well. Having said that, I do get a lot of questions about not just the bodies of knowledge, but even tool vendors. I can tell you we had tool vendors like ServiceNow, Freshservice, Remedy BMC, Hornbill. They've all been part of the development effort thus far. But how their tools will reflect ITIL 4, how ISO or COBIT or any of these other frameworks will reflect ITIL 4, that's not for me to say. These are commercial products, for lack of a better phrase. These are products that are being managed by other organizations. We are yet to be told how to respond to that question by these other bodies of knowledge. But we're doing our best to work with the community. We're doing our best to work with the actual organizations themselves to be able to jointly produce guidance. But until we're able to get to that point, we're working with core individuals from those areas, from those domains, to be able to build in some of that alignment at the very start.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Akshay. I think we can have one more question. Then we've already run over time, so we'll probably have to sign off there. We've had a few questions actually about Internet of Things. There's one question here: is there an incorporation within ITIL 4 of Internet of Things? Is that? Can you answer that one?
Sure. So ITIL has always been a technology agnostic framework. It's about the management of services, not the management of technology. Having said that, technology is a core enabler of services. It could be the core channel of engagement or transaction. So we're always on the lookout for people who can come on board and perhaps write some very specialized supplementary content that talks about how to apply the concepts of ITIL 4, co-creation of value, practices, not processes, etc., to things like cloud computing or Internet of Things and so on. So from a core guidance perspective, you're not necessarily going to find a chapter that says ITIL 4 and the Internet of Things. What we're looking to do instead is to use the reference architecture, if you will, of ITIL 4 Foundation to author supplementary pieces that talk about how to apply these concepts into a specific scenario, such as IoT, cloud computing, and so on. If that person who asked the question can get in touch with me, I'm actually very interested in getting some more guidance written up, supplementary guidance written up on the Internet of Things and how ITIL 4 can assist with the management of IoT. So if the person who asked that question could get in touch with me, I would be very, very grateful.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Akshay. I mean, there's a lot of questions we haven't got to, so we will be going through those, and we'll hopefully be able to get back to you with some answers. For now, as linking to what Akshay was just talking about, for supplementary content, you'll see in the resources section of the webinar platform, we have uploaded some of the latest pieces of supplementary content, so you can access those there. I guess that's all we've got time for, really. Apologies for running over time. Thank you very much for your attendance of the session. We have got a little survey for your feedback when you close the window. If you could fill that in, that would be really helpful. And thanks, Akshay, for presenting. Really good. Got some great feedback. So well done all round. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.